Chapter 4 The Christian Silent Majority. On the eve of the 1964 presidential election, Billy Graham told the press that his only family was politically divided. His 16-year-old daughter Anne had recently gone to a rally for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater and had endorsed the Arizona senator, but the nation's best-known evangelist insisted that he did not support his daughter's action. "President Johnson will get my prayers day and night," Graham said. He refused to issue an endorsement in the election, and he advised the churches to stay out of straight politics. The divide into Graham's family was replicated on a national scale. The coalition of conservative Protestants that had supported Richard Nixon in 1960 had disintegrated into competing factions. Some evangelicals, including Graham, supported the civil rights legislation, but many Southern fundamentalists staunchly opposed such measures, and they championed Goldwater's candidacy as a way to fight the combined evils of communism, secularism, and civil rights. Although the term was not yet in use, religious rights seemed to be developing among the Southern fundamentalists, who argued that the Republican Party's platform promoted Christian values. But opposing them was an even larger group of religious liberals who believed that the civil rights activists were on God's side and that Goldwater was not. Mainstream evangelicals such as Graham fell between the two positions. Before a Christian silent majority could take shape, evangelicals and fundamentalists had to come to an agreement on issues such as race and politics. Fundamentalists had preached against the civil rights movement almost since its inception, but until the early 1960s they had directed their rhetoric primarily against civil rights activists, not the federal government. That changed on June 1963 when President John F. Kennedy endorsed a civil rights bill that promised to bring more substantive gains for African Americans than any other previous piece of 20th century legislation, appealing the nation's Christian consciousness. The president declared the problem of racial discrimination a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. Civil rights were a moral issue for Southern fundamentalists as well, but not in the way that Kennedy had suggested. They saw the movement as an attack. They saw the movement as an attack on the nation's well-being and a threat to the right private institutions, including churches, to exclude anyone they wished. In 1963, Noel Smith wrote in his Baptist Bible Tribune that if Kennedy's proposed civil rights bill passed, any segregated church would lose its tax exemption, and the increased governmental control that would result with such legislation would soon lead down a slippery slope toward a full-fledged communist regime in America. Mr. Kennedy is demanding that Congress enact legislation that will make the federal government the absolute master of all stores, hotels, motels, restaurants, and theaters, Smith wrote. By the same logic, by the same principle of law, the federal government can become the master of any churches of this country. Not only can, but will. And what kind of government will we then have? A communist government. Nearly every fundamentalist preacher who wrote against civil rights movement argued that at length that he did not harbor any animosity against the Negro, and that he knew many fine black Christians. But the civil rights agitators were in a different category because their demands were opposed to the fundamental Christian values, such as the rights of the free association and private property and the rule of law. The basic proposition of those Negro agitators is that they should have what they want, not on basis of character or respect for law and order of the basic rules of personal and community health, but solely on the ground that their skin is black, Smith wrote, which means that they are contending for the very thing they profess to condemn, progress on the basis of the color of skin. But Smith had confidence that their campaign would fail. Mr. Kennedy, the Supreme Court, and the mobs are not going to succeed in forcing people to associate themselves against their mutual will and their mutual interest, he said. Southern fundamentalists were aghast in the spring of 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's successor, succeeded in what they thought was the impossible: securing a strong civil rights act that abolished legalized segregation in America. They had disliked Kennedy, but they discovered that Johnson, a fellow Southern Democrat, was even worse. Bob Jones Jr. announced that because of his opposition to uh, interracial marriage and dating, his university would refuse to admit African Americans in defiance of law. If that resulted in the loss of the university's tax exemption, he would consider it religious persecution, a stance that set him on a religiously inspired campaign against the president. "You can't preach today without preaching against the administration," he said. Alienated from the government, some fundamentalists turned to politicians on the right whose campaign centered on attacking Washington bureaucrats. Jones awarded Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace, an honorary doctorate from his university in May 1964, while the governor was in the midst of an unsuccessful challenge to President Johnson for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Wallace's opposition to civil rights legislation, Jones said, provided confirmation that still remained. At least some hope for the preservation of the constitutional liberties. At a time when fundamentalists such as Jones were becoming increasingly testy about their representation in the media, they took heart to that. Wallace, too, had been slandered, maligned, and misrepresented by biased journalists, but had boldly maintained his defensive principles he believed in, such as courage, Jones said, and the governor, a David warring against the giant tyranny. The close alliance between the fundamentalists and the South's racist right worried political analysts. The close alliance between fundamentalists and the Southern racist right worried political analysts. The assassination of a popular liberal president, an event that some people blamed on the influence of the right-wing extremism in Dallas, and the unexpected success of the ultra-conservative Senator Barry Goldwater in the Republican Party presidential primaries seemed to be the signs of a rejuvenated radical right, a movement many thought had died with Joe McCarthy, combining fears of internal communist subversion with opposition to the United Nations and civil rights. The radical right, a term that political analysis of the time to describe groups ranging from the John Birch Society and anti-communist radio broadcasters, was on the rise in the early 1960s. A flood of books published in 1964, including Arnold Foster and Benjamin Epstein's Danger on the Right, Brooks Walker's The Christian Fright Peddlers, and Harry and Bonaro Overstreet's The Strange Tactics of Extremism, argued that the far right was rational and anti-democratic, a charge that echoed the arguments that Columbia historian Richard Hofstadter had made the previous year in Daniel Bell's edited volume, The Radical Right. Hofstadter blamed the paranoia on the right of the fundamentalist religion. To understand the Manichaean style of thought, the apocalyptic tendencies, the love of mystification, the intolerance of compromise that are observable in the right-wing mind, we need to understand the history of fundamentalism. Such vilification from the intellectual establishment ensured that whatever political influence fundamentalists enjoyed would be regionally and religiously isolated, but it also increased fundamentalists' feelings of alienation and their determination to make their voice heard that seemed increasingly hostile. You know, this book has a typo in it. There's a start quote, but no end quote to this quote. Unless it's just another quote within the quote, but there's an odd number of quotation marks. Oh. Fundamentalist support for Goldwater. Fundamentalists who thought that Washington had abandoned the American values considered Barry Goldwater a godsend. In a Republican Party that still heavily influenced the Northeastern business interests and moderate liberals, Goldwater's straight-shooting conservative rhetoric, Southwestern heritage, and anti-communist message, as well as hostility to most all federal social spending, put him on the far right of the nation's political spectrum. For many young Republicans, including the campus activists and the staunchly conservative Young Americans for Freedom, That was exactly what they wanted. Goldwater was especially popular among conservative activists in Southern California, a center for the Sun Belt conservatism that later became the dominant political ideology in the Republican Party. The GOP's northwestern wing held Goldwater in low esteem and expected uh, the liberal New York governor Nelson Rockefeller to win the party's presidential nomination. Fundamentalists had not traditionally taken an interest in presidential primaries, but they showed an unusual concern about Rockefeller because of his recent high-profile divorce and remarriage. In 1962, after 31 years of marriage, the New York governor had divorced his wife, and a year later he had married a woman who had left her husband and 4 children only a month before. With this scandal fresh on their minds, fundamentalists viewed Rockefeller's candidacy as a threat to a country's morals and symbol of ominous secular trend. How can the decent, respectable people of the United States possibly place in the White House a man whose conduct is so obviously contrary to the moral standards of the Holy Scriptures that pertain to holy matrimony? The Sword of the Lord, editorialized in July 1963. May there be enough God-fearing people left in the United States to see that Nelson Rockefeller is not elected to the highest office in the governor of this republic. The conservative Protestant reaction against Rockefeller was especially strong in California because of the importance of the state's primary. As Rockefeller and Goldwater competed for votes in the nation's largest state, conservative Protestants rallied against the New York governor. One of the pastors who was particularly perturbed by the thought of Rockefeller winning the nomination was Tim LaHaye, a 38-year-old Baptist pastor in suburban San Diego. LaHaye had grown up working in the working-class single-parent home in Detroit. After serving in World War II, he had studied the Bible at Bob Jones University school that reinforced his family's fundamentalist Baptist religion. While LaHaye was at BJU, Bob Jones Jr. was beginning to lead the school into anti-communist politics. But LaHaye said little in public about politics during the 1950s. After pastoring churches in rural South Carolina and urban Minneapolis, LaHaye and his wife Beverly moved to San Diego in 1956. The area was home to many Southern evangelicals who shared the LaHaye's religious values, but it was also the region where cultural liberalism, represented by easy divorce and casual sex, coexisted in uneasy tension with more traditional moral standards. In this environment, LaHaye had become involved in an emerging conservative movement that was deeply suspicious of communism, social welfare spending, and cultural permissiveness, and that viewed Barry Goldwater as a hero. He began giving talks at meetings of the John Birch Society. In May 1964, shortly before his state's Republican primary, LaHaye sent a letter to evangelical pastors throughout California, urging them to vote against Rockefeller. A wife stealer who divorced his wife of 30 years, broke up another man's home, and took a mother from her 4 children. Stands a good chance to win the approval of the Republican voters in California, LaHaye wrote. If he is elected, it will be the same as public approval of his wicked actions and help to skyrocket our divorce rate. He announced that he intended to deliver a Sunday morning sermon against Rockefeller and urged other pastors to do the same. The cost of being silent is too great, he warned. Goldwater defeated Rockefeller for the nomination and quickly won the support of many of the South's leading fundamentalists. They endorsed most of Goldwater's political positions, especially his hardline anti-communist and opposition to civil rights. At a time where most of the nation's political leaders were becoming increasingly concerned about the dangers of nuclear weapons and welcomed anti-proliferation treaties with the Soviet Union, Goldwater, like many other fundamentalists, opposed such negotiations. And the senator's laissez-faire libertarian ideals were good news for fundamentalists who feared the state power. I'm going to skip ahead here for the sake of time. Um, the Christians' silent majority. Shocking cultural changes swept the United States in 1967. Thousands of hippies converged in the hot Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco for a summer of drugs, sex music, and counterculture protest. During that same summer, angry African Americans in Detroit destroyed 1,300 buildings in a spontaneous eruption of rage against racist oppression. Washington, D.C., 50,000 protesters descended on the Pentagon to announce the Vietnam War. Young men followed the example of the beatless and began growing their hair out in opposition to their parents' wishes. Young women openly flouted the prevailing sexual norms in order to engage in free love. Society, many Americans believed, was being torn apart uh, from within. No one felt this sense of unease more keenly than the fundamentalists and evangelicals. Nearly all the major fundamentalist publications in the 1960s were filled with warnings about the nation's moral disintegration. In Oakland, California, Baptist preacher uh, Weniger built his newspaper with warnings about sexual revolution and alleged communist lyrics in rock and music and crime. From his office in Springfield, Missouri, Noel Smith, the editor of the Baptist Bible Tribune, lamented America's national sins, ranging from the Supreme Court's decision on school prayer and Bible reading in the early 1960s to perceived breakdown in law and order at the end of the decade. John R. Rice gives his readers a similar diet of doom and gloom pronouncements. The social upheaval related to the civil rights movement, the urban race rights, sex education, and the nation's high-profile assassinations alarmed him. The Sword of the Lord proclaimed in 1968 that the crisis had brought the country to the brink of war. Evangelicals were just as alarmed. Okay, brain not work so good. I'm done here, but yeah.